Hitting record here. All right. Friends, welcome to our third table talk. It's really amazing to me to think that we are now this far into the series, and I'm thrilled that you've joined us here tonight. My name is Mallory Wyckoff. I serve as Executive Director of Faith and Culture Center. For some of you, this may be your first experience with Faith and Culture Center. If so, welcome. We're so glad that you are here. And for you especially, I want to share just briefly about the history of FCC before I talk about the Table Talk series. So really, we got our start back in 2008 when a local mosque in Columbia, Tennessee, just south of Nashville, was firebombed by several white supremacists. And one of the board members there, who is one of our co-founders and president of our board, Dawood Aboudiab, as part of that experience and in his work with the community and response, really out of the ashes of all that, Faith and Culture Center was built as a way to productively address and counter Islamophobia. And so we work to integrate communities across divides of faith, race, ethnicity, and culture. We're seeking to break barriers and help people build relationships and forge friendships across those divides that otherwise can keep us separate. We want those to be the things that actually bring us to the table to ensure everyone has a seat at the table and we're able to build relationships and build stronger communities. So that is what we are about. As we think about our work, we have what we call our 5 pillars of building inclusive communities. And we see those as being humility, understanding, respect, empathy, and compassion. So you will see those woven through everything that we do. I think you'll hear some of those themes even in our discussion tonight. But specifically thinking about this program and why we wanted to put together the Table Talk series is because central to everything that we do is bringing people together, as I said, across those divides and often around shared tables for shared meals and conversations about things that really matter. Clearly, we're in a season where we're unable to gather together at those tables like we are so fond of doing. So we decided to create this Table Talk series to bring our table to you, to the community, and to invite these incredible teams of panelists, these experts and practitioners and deep thinkers to talk about things that really are important, things that are very timely and essential conversations to be having. And certainly the conversation we're going to have tonight is one of those. And so I'm thrilled to that end to be able to introduce our panelists, which I'll do so briefly. And then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Bethy Butler, who will be facilitating the conversation portion of the night. But firstly, I want to introduce Dr. Hasina Moyuddin. She completed her PhD this year in 2020, which I'm thinking, yay, something lovely came out of the year 2020. So congratulations, Hasina, to you. She completed her PhD from Vanderbilt University this year, where she now serves as the Assistant Dean of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And specifically, her dissertation research looked at aspects of religious identity development for Muslim American youth as they're experiencing Islamophobia and negative stereotypes and so forth. So Hasina, thank you so much for joining us. Glad you're here. Kassar Abdullah, who is originally from Kurdistan and Iraq, has called Nashville home for 20 years. And her prior work has included serving with the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition, served on numerous nonprofit boards, and her most recent work, beginning in 2013, was being a founding member of Valor Collegiate Academies, where she now serves as the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer as well. Kassar, so glad you're here. Kassar and I also did some graduate work together, so I love that connection, and I'm glad you're here, Kassar. Thank you. Julie Fortune is one of our panelists. If you attended our 2019 Music City Iftar, which we were so sad to miss this year and grateful we were able to do it in 2019, but if you had the pleasure of being there, then you also had the pleasure of hearing from Julie Fortune, who was one of our speakers for that night. She was also one of our 2018 Abdul Qadir ambassadors, and currently she serves as the Director of Admissions for Akiva School, which is a local private Jewish K-6 day school. Julie, thank you for being here. And last and certainly but not least, Bana Faraj. She is a senior English education major here at Lipscomb University, really passionate about teaching students at a young age to not simply wait for answers to life, but to be proactive and put forth effort. She also has served as a camp counselor for the Pioneer Fall Camp that really works to lead students to explore education in depth. And so I think based on these very brief bios that I've offered, you will understand quickly why we have asked this group of panelists to join us tonight and to share their expertise and insight with us. And lastly, as I said, my colleague Bethy Butler, she'll be facilitating the conversation tonight, but just to say that certainly that she has been involved in education broadly and then specifically here in the Nashville community for many years, serving with Metro Nashville Public Schools in various capacities, has been teaching at Lipscomb University for several years. And so we're thrilled to get to have her join this conversation tonight. So with that, Bethy, I'm going to turn it over to you. Let's dive into the discussion.
All right. Thank you, Mallory. Thank you all for being here tonight. This is a conversation that when Mallory and I were talking about table talks, I was very drawn to it. So I appreciate everybody taking the time to attend tonight, as well as those of our panelists who can speak to this in such a beautiful way. So my very first question is talking about differences. So Muslim youth typically feel they face great challenges in school, especially in regards to integration with their social peers. They're also very vulnerable to Islamophobia and religious discrimination. And so I want to open it up with Hasina. How can we talk about differences in order to recognize both personal and institutional blind spots and to appreciate differences?
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And I'm really excited to talk to my colleagues here about this topic. And I think the first thing is to talk about differences. I think it's so important for us to remember that those differences are something that our youth are thinking about and struggling with sometimes. Because of what happens a lot of times, particularly when we talk about religion, we talk about the things that we hold that are the same, right? And those are really important things to consider, and brings us together and gives us a shared sense of community. But it's also important to really appreciate the ways in which we are different, and also to have a way to talk about those differences in positive and strength-based ways. I think a lot of times we don't facilitate those conversations in which we can have youth talk about those, and because we're not talking about them, youth often feel like those are parts that they can't discuss, right? We can talk about the things that make us the same. We can talk about our belief in one God. We can talk about ways to love our neighbor. But when you think about the things that make us different, sometimes our youth feel like they have to hide those parts. They don't have the words or the ways to communicate what they believe in terms of those things that make them different. And we don't do a great job of teaching kids or even adults, right, to talk about those differences and have a way of doing that very respectfully and in ways that deepen understanding between people, and have that appreciative inquiry kind of lens to learning about other people, other faiths, other cultures. And so I think the first really important thing to me is, yes, let us always kind of think about things that bring us together and that we share in common, but also create a space to talk about those things where we do have differences, and do it in a way that is appreciative and helps youth be able to feel a sense of pride in their own religious and cultural heritage.
Thank you. Julie, I saw you nodding. What are your thoughts?
I mean, I really appreciate everything that you just said. And I think what really stood out to me is the fact that we also, not only do children look to adults to have these conversations, which I think we're just not having right now. I also think that there is a level of vulnerability that we really have to have about ourselves, and that vulnerability sometimes shows us things about ourselves that we might not always really want to face. And sort of holding up that mirror to ourselves is really, I think, what the scariest part is. But but I also feel like it is, I deeply believe that when someone is vulnerable, they're actually their strongest, and they're actually being incredibly courageous. And so that is such a value that I believe we should teach all of our children to really, you know, be courageous, to be upstanders for what we believe in. But to be an upstander also really means that we have to have a deep sense of self, of who we are, and also where our blind spots are. And so I just couldn't agree with you more that these conversations just really aren't taking place. And it's really the conversation of differences that is important. And I think the only thing I was also thinking about when you said that is our beliefs might complement each other insofar as, like you said, like a lot of times we're monotheistic, but really when it comes down to observance and practice, and actually the way that we choose to live our lives is incredibly different. And while those differences can seem like a barrier to connect to others, I actually feel like it's such a beautiful space to open up an opportunity to learn. So I was just reflecting on what you were saying. That's really all. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Kassar, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I wanted to actually really appreciate Hasina for saying the importance of recognizing differences. I think human being, we are born with a level of curiosity to discover and explore what's different. I mean, I have 4 children, so even seeing my youngest, you know, who's a pre-K age, she's constantly curious about differences that she witnessed around her. She notices that her lunchbox has different items in it than her friend, and she's very curious to have a conversation. I think we need to go back to that curiosity. We need to go back to being curious about each other. We need to go back in being thirsty about learning from each other, about each other, right? And I think that's the first step I wanted to make note on. And secondly, in order to also better understand the differences around us, we have to begin with understanding who we are. So understand thyself, I should say. And, you know, also questioning, like, who am I? What are my identities? How am I the same and how am I different in this space or next to the community that I'm in? What are my sources of knowledge about the people that I encounter? Where am I getting my knowledge from? And how is that having an impact the way I view or value or see or connect with the people around me? What are my blind spots, right? We all have them, right? This whole concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion is a journey. It is not a destination. Each of us will be at a different point on our journey. And we have to be willing to continue to walk. And I do believe once you recognize differences, you're going to notice that these differences bring meaning to our life, right? It makes it more meaningful and more engaging and more exciting. And diversity does make us stronger.
Thank you. All right, Bana, what are your thoughts about this?
Yes, I agree with everyone on the panel. I think they put it so beautifully. The only thing I can think to add is that I think there's a difference between understanding and agreement, and I think that's where people get mixed up. It's this idea that I can't somehow understand you without also consenting to my agreement to your ideology or to your belief or your convictions. And so making sure that we understand that distinction when we are looking at differences is that you can totally understand someone's perspective, why they believe what they believe, what it is they believe, without necessarily agreeing. And there is no gray area in that. It's very clear that you can understand, but I don't agree with your choices or your belief or your concept. And I think that's what the problem is. I think in understanding, people can sometimes feel they've consented to total agreement in, you know, your idea of how life should be led. So that's the only thing I can think of to add.
Yeah, you all made really beautiful points, and I appreciate that. So in 2015, an article published by Murfat Ayesh Al-Subeh in the Journal of Education and Practice highlighted current issues in the multicultural classroom. He named low academic achievement, adjustment to the new cultural environment, and issues of trust with self and the new culture. So, Kasar, I'm going to start with you, and then y'all can jump in. How do we move beyond simply accommodating our students, and how do we move toward awareness of systems that are in place that don't address all of our students' needs?
I think we have to be very truthful and honest to say that the American education system was created and intended for some to benefit from and not others. So the American education system has been based on white privileged Christian community. So if you don't fall in that category, you're going to face a lot of disparities. And we have to be honest about it, that it was actually designed and intended to keep some people down or out from advancing. And it was created to let some advance and not others. So just being very honest about the fact we are working inside an institution that has a whole lot of racism and injustices embodied in there. And so by recognizing that, then we have to question and say, how is our education system competent to our base now, and how is it not, right? And what do we need to address it? I think we have to address the policies, right? And so, for example, even under the Civil Rights Title VI, there's mention of bullying and harassment. And they talk about bullying and harassment based on race, color, or national origin. Religion is not even mentioned. So think about it, even in the policy, it's not mentioned. So I think we have to look at it from the systematic level and start addressing it, right? What are the policies and procedures that are preventing students that are not as inclusive, that are not equitable? Talking about our culture, the mindset that we carry, right? Do we have a savior mentality, and we think if you don't think like me, speak like me, dress like me, eat, stand up, and talk like me, that I'm obligated to save you because I feel like you're not going to progress in the world, right? And that has to be, that's like a mindset and a culture shift. And we're going to have diversity of perspectives, and I believe diversity of perspectives are also important. But the broader question would be is, what exactly is the purpose of our education system? What is the purpose of our schools? For a teacher that is actually standing up in front of those students, should question and say, why am I here to stand in front of these children? I truly personally believe that no one should be given the honor of teaching if they cannot love and embrace every single student in that classroom. Because as Maya Angelou said, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel.
I love that. My little teacher heart is so happy right now. Thank you. Bana, I'm going to go to you next. So how do we move simply beyond accommodating?
Yeah, I think Kasar put it beautifully. The idea of education, like she said, was founded on the idea of excluding some members of Western society. So in the beginning, education was started off the fact of teaching Western kids how to read the Bible. And that's really where it came from. It was the idea of we need more people to be literate in reading the Bible. And in order to do so, we're going to create this system of schooling. And that's how schooling came about. And as the years have progressed and as knowledge is gained, then we added history and geography and, and we are here today. But like Kasar said, the idea of teaching does depend a lot on what is the goal of teaching. So for me, hopefully, God willing, when I do start teaching, the idea is to teach students differently from how we are. That's the one thing to be optimistic about. I think a lot of new, fresh teachers that are coming into the game have a very different idea of what education looks like than what we've been taught. And I think that's very hopeful, and that gives you hope in that sense. They're teaching us a lot more about teaching students to learn who they are and being comfortable in their identity and figuring that out. I'm more high school oriented, and so for me, that is the weirdest time for a lot of students, and they don't know who they are, but they're very adamant that they do at that age. And so it's finding that balance and figuring out how can you get all students to maybe not necessarily agree with who each person is, but just understand that they are not alone in this world, and they inhabit it with people that are very different from themselves. And that's the beauty of living. And so that's what I would say, is just figuring out how to get students to be more confident in who they are, and understanding that that confidence doesn't threaten your identity alongside that.
Yeah, nice. Hasina.
So this is such a great panel because I'm learning so much as we go as well. But I think, you know, to both Kasara and Bana's point, like, we also have to expand our idea of systems, right? In terms of, like, not just what teachers do in the classroom, but how are we treating teachers, right? How are we actually getting our underrepresented teachers into schools, into classrooms, and supporting them to be the role models and to provide the kind of things that Bana is talking about to help students to know who they are. How are those systems being built? Because I think also the systems for teachers to get into teaching is filled with white privilege, right? It privileges certain groups to be able to use that as to have that as a career. For people who, you know, are thinking about teaching or passionate about teaching, there are so many roadblocks to, there can be so many roadblocks to getting into a school, being hired, getting the professional development, and all of the supports to be a successful teacher. So I think, you know, like, expanding our idea of what systems actually affect teaching and education. You know, we were talking about at Peabody, you know, there are grants that will support students but won't support teachers. What is that? Like, teachers are somehow separated from the educational process of what's happening with students. So there are pieces of this larger system in terms of grants and funding, in terms of hiring, in terms of how people get promoted, that are also important to consider. And I also would love to kind of go back to the idea, when we start talking about accommodations, that means that system wasn't built for you. And so how can we actually start to get rid of accommodations and build those into the system, and so that the system is actually built for everybody? So those are kind of my, like, 2 cents.
And I just wanted to build on that from, like, personal experience, right? So now I have an 8th grader. So by middle school, students start to question, right? And she said, Mom, hold on, I calculated the days. I take off almost a month or so for Christian holidays, but yet the schools are not willing to give me 1 day to celebrate Eid. And so I have to ask special permission to be excused. And then I miss instruction on that day. And then I have to go back, and, you know, the anxiety and stress of, like, making up your test if you missed it, or your classwork. And so she couldn't even understand it. She said, I'm willing to take 2 weeks off of my education and I stay home. So my friends, now we've played word games, and we used to call it Christmas break. Now they call it winter break. You know, for my friends, so they could be with their family to celebrate. Why is it that I can't get 1 day so I could be with my friends, right? And so, but then people say we're accommodating. It's like, wait a second, you created a system to exclude a population. Yeah, so I appreciate you for bringing that up, Hasina.
And also, you know, Ramadan is going to be in May, April and May again. So finals and exams. So definitely something to think about.
Thank you. Julie?
Yeah, I think, first of all, like, I feel so honored to be around these amazing, brilliant women. So thank you guys just for sharing your thoughts. It's so wonderful to hear what you're saying. And what I've been thinking, and something that I heard the other day that resonated with me so deeply, is that the bottom line is that representation matters, right? And so it is important for children to see people who are in leadership roles, whether that is, a teacher or an administrator or a coach who is similar to them in some way. And so many times there are systems and there are programs and opportunities that empower people to become educators for short bits of time, right? So the commitment could be 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and that can seem, we were talking about a savior sort of mentality, as people who look very different kind of coming into a space where students look very different than them and live very different lifestyles, and then they sort of swoop in and teach for 2 years and kind of move on. And I just think that it's important for students to be able to have people who mirror their lifestyle, and to be able to have leaders of saying, like, just like what you were saying, Kassar, with your daughter, like being able to not talk to only you about that, to be able to go to a leader in her school and say, I mean, I'm assuming you're probably one of the leaders in her school, but someone who's not her mom, to say, you know, how come this is the case and what can we do to change it? And part of that is also about the school itself. And this is going smaller instead of bigger, but the school really empowering students and listening to what our children have to say and saying, I hear your idea. I think this is a really good idea. How can we make this work for our community, right? And so I think that there is like a big picture problem, but I also think that there are small steps that as school leaders we can take to empower our students to advocate for who they are and what they need, and for us as leaders to give children their voice and to listen to their voice so that they know things that they want to change can really happen. And it doesn't just have to happen like in a period, it can happen on a big level. And that I deeply believe that giving children that opportunity, whether they're in kindergarten or in 8th grade or in high school, but giving children that opportunity to learn that their ideas are really brilliant and that they can change the world, like makes a difference in our life. Like that empowers them to say, like, okay, I can do this. So yes, that's all I have to say.
Yes, thank you. And I'm actually going to continue with you, Julie. I would like to go a little bit deeper as well and talk about intersectionality and how that might contribute to misconceptions or exclusion. So I'll let you talk about that.
Yeah, so I think intersectionality is really, really interesting because, you know, when I think of intersectionality, I tend to think of sort of the stereotypical topics, right? So there's gender and there's sexual identity and there's race and ethnicity and religion, and we can look at how all of these overlap each other. And I think we all know that there are people who have, misconceptions about one part of somebody's identity, and many times that can just be contradictory to the way that they have another stereotype about another part of our identity. You know, the other thing that I think is really important to add is that identities are not stagnant, right? That identities are really fluid, and that the way that we identify shifts and changes over time. So whether we're addressing, you know, sexual orientation, whether we're addressing gender, whether we're addressing socioeconomic status, however that is, like those are fluid, and the way that we choose to identify, is really complex. So I just like wanted to put that as like the grounding of talking and thinking through this question. The other thing that I think is really important to point out is that when we talk about intersectionality and misconceptions, a lot of times, I think that sometimes the questions are so big that some people really struggle to even figure out the right questions that they want to ask. So when someone might be really different than, not just who they are, but when somebody's identity really challenges somebody else's stereotypes about something, I have found that many times people just want to shut down. And so simply opening up that space to have that conversation, I think is important. But I think it's actually a really complex question, and I don't have the full solution to that. That's a really deep question. So I will turn to some of my panelists as well, because yeah, I'll just turn it to you, because I think that's a really heavy question.
It is, you're right. I know Hasina would love to talk about it. This is something she's passionate about. So
yeah, I think that just like with many other groups, people tend to think of Muslims as this monolithic block, that we are kind of all coming from the Arab world. We are all kind of have this one belief of Islam, that we are very similar to one another, without appreciating just how much intersectionality is within our community, and how important it is to acknowledge for Muslim youth that the multiple identities that they have, and that those multiple identities can lead to very different experiences. And different Muslim kids have different levels of comfort in their identities, and different levels of privilege that they are able to walk in the world with. And so I think, especially in the Muslim world, there's greater acknowledgement. I think there's several kind of organizations that are doing work with youth, that particularly like working with Black Muslim Americans, working with Muslim Americans who are English language learners, who might not have the same experiences as maybe a South Asian Muslim. They're facing very different, both ethnic and social contexts, which shape how they think about Islam and how they move in the world. And I think it's really important for us to not just acknowledge, but to also understand how these intersecting identities affect their experiences. And because if we don't, we won't be able to really support them in the ways that they need to be supported. I think what we tend to do is support kind of a normative idea of Muslim youth, and that's great for that group, and that tends to be the group with the most privilege within the Muslim community. And there are a lot of Muslim kids that are associated with the mosque and have strong parental ties and are getting a lot of resources, but it's leaving out a lot of other Muslim youth who might not have those resources, who don't face the same kind of situations, who have to deal with other types of discrimination, who have to deal with racial discrimination, who have to deal with gender discrimination. And if we don't talk about those differences, we're never going to be able to address the challenges that all of our Muslim youth face. So yeah, I do definitely want people to think about it and acknowledge the importance of those intersectional differences.
Hasina, can I ask you a question? When you talk about the differences and people not acknowledging them, are you talking about that in the Muslim community from like the inside out, or from the outside in, or both? Or
yeah. And I'd love to hear other people talk about it too, because
I was gonna actually just add, I have a slight different perspective from my good friend Julie on when it comes to identities. I think that we have two pieces of our identities. There are pieces that are actually fixed and they're not fluid. And then we have identities that are fluid. An example of that, our race can never be fluid. I'm born Kurdish. No matter where I go on earth, I'll be Kurdish. That's what my identity is. You're born Black, you are Black, like no matter where you go, right? And so, but there are other identities, which I wholeheartedly, and I appreciate Julie for naming, that are actually fluid. For example, your socioeconomic status is very fluid. Today you could be quite rich, tomorrow a natural disaster hits and you are rock bottom. Vice versa, you could win the lottery and now you went from being homeless on the streets to being a billionaire, right? So socioeconomic status is fluid. Faith, I believe, is very fluid, right? So today I could be Muslim, tomorrow I could, leave the faith of Islam and practice Christianity. So faith in itself also is fluid, right? So there are many pieces of our identities that are fluid, but there are pieces of our identity that are not fluid, right? And they're very fixed. And so how do we recognize that, and how we sort of incorporate that? And to Hasina's point, I also appreciate you for saying that there's no such thing as the Muslim community. There's a diverse set of communities. And the experiences sometimes are similar and sometimes quite different. So I'll share a story with you that's very heartbreaking. And right now it's still on my mind. It has touched me because I am a daughter. I have 4 daughters. I am a mother to 4 daughters. And I have one of my daughter who's a basketball player. Though she chose not to wear the hijab, she hasn't thought about wearing it. It's her choice. And so 2 days ago, one volleyball player, a volleyball Muslim player, was ready to play the game and wears the hijab, and was told by the referee she has to get off the court and cannot play the game because of that headgear on your head. Now, this is very explicit and, painful, because the student herself, she's an African-American Muslim who wears the hijab, right? I mean, think about the pain of, that the African-Americans are facing and still continue to face. And now she's also facing issues of her faith and inclusion. And this is we did the research, and it is a policy. I mean, this is legitimately a policy, a national policy and a state policy that basically says you have to prove that you're Muslim, you have to prove that the head covering is religious, and you have to prove that your headgear is not going to be a health hazard. So think about the impact that it had on that one student and all the other Muslim students who were watching. What is that saying? Is that really being inclusive? And so there are systematic policy issues that are very real, right? And when you talk about intersectionality as well. And so you have to see that student for her identities. You can't see her as a Arab from Middle East just because she has a headscarf on. She's an American. Her whole lineage, she's been here for centuries. She doesn't know any other place but Nashville. And so there are, when it comes to intersectionality, I think the dangers are people tend to see Muslims as one monolithic community. I get approached over and over again about Arabic and speaking Arabic, and I'm like, I really wish I knew Arabic. I really did. I tried really hard, but I don't. And so being able to really recognize the individual and recognize their identities and their fluid identities, embracing them as much as their fixed identities, is very important for intersectionality work to happen and to be successful.
Thank you, Kassar. Julie?
Kassar, I just want to, I really appreciate what you said about saying that some parts of us are fixed. And I think that for some people, some parts of their identity are very fixed. I guess I'm thinking, for instance, of my children who are mixed. I think that they are, I don't think they actually fully understand when we talk about race, how they identify. I think what's really interesting is my son tends to identify himself. He's like, I'm brown like daddy. And I'm like, what am I, chopped liver? Like, what, you're part of me too. But I think that what I'm seeing with him, and he's only 5, is that he's trying to navigate that as well. And what you point to, or what you've helped me also really think about, is while we might see ourselves as having fluid identities in certain areas, the bottom line is that some people just don't see that as a fluid identity. And there's value in that too. Like sometimes we just need to know stats on things. Like when we're, applying for grants, all of us have applied for a grant, and we need to know, this is the breakdown of our students. These are the amount of boys, these are the amount of girls. Like I understand the value in that, But I also think that sometimes for, sorry, speaking of children, my son just opened the door. I also think that there are, especially for young children, sometimes they're trying, children who might not identify necessarily with either white or black or one race or another, I do think that is fluid for them. But I also think you're right to say that maybe our boxes just aren't broad enough when we start to check things. So I just appreciate your point. Thank you.
Absolutely. Like I agree with you. And also like the whole race concept is such an American concept that is outdated and got to go. And more Americans cannot fit into those boxes. My daughter, who also, she was in kindergarten, and when she attended school, her teacher said, this was last year, "Hi, honey, how are you? Where are you from?" And she said, "Nashville." She said, "No, where were you born?" She said, "Centennial Hospital." And so she couldn't even understand it. Her teacher then was like, "Well, where were your parents from? What do they speak? What language?" And, went on and on. But in her concept, her identity, she's American, right? She's born here. Her first language is actually English. No matter how hard I speak to her in Kurdish, she responds in English. But the society still sees her as not American, right? Like that identity. So I appreciate you for highlighting that.
Thank you both for those ideas and your personal stories. I really appreciate that. Bana, did you want to talk about intersectionality at all?
For the sake of time, I think I will sit this one out.
Okay, that's okay. Speaking of statistics, though, I did pull a few, and I wanted to just see how you guys feel about these and how we can address these. So according to a study published in 2017 by the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, Muslim school-aged children are 4 times as likely to be bullied as the general public. Of these incidents, 1/4 involved bullying by a teacher or other school official. Prior to that study, the Californian chapter of the Council of American Islamic Relations published results from a survey regarding how comfortable American Muslim students felt attending their schools and participating in the classroom. 50% of Muslim youth in this study experienced psychological bullying, while 21% experienced cyberbullying and 10% physical bullying. 17% of girls wearing the hijab were bullied because of this. So the stories that you've already shared, Kassar in particular, reflect these statistics. I want to ask, and Hasina, I'm going to let you answer this one first. How does our current social emotional instruction, especially in regards to bullying, how does that exclude various types of underrepresented students? And I know some of that has already been addressed, but do you want to go a little further with that?
You know what, I might defer actually to Kassar since she has more school-based experience, and or Bana, because I definitely want Bana's voice to be in the discussion as well.
Yes.
Bana, you want to go first? I took too much airspace. I'll go after you.
It was wonderful airspace. I would say on a personal level, Kassar's story kind of reminded me of when I was in middle school. I played 2 years of soccer, and my middle school years, I had not started practicing the hijab yet. So it was very easy for me. I was wearing shorts and tees just like the other girls. And then as the season switched over, I had kind of explored my own faith, and I started practicing the hijab in middle school. And so when I did that, I wanted to sign up for volleyball. And I was just so excited about it. I thought it was so aggressive, and something about it was just wonderful. But volleyball had spandex, and it's extremely tight shorts and a tee. And all I had asked my coach was if I could just alter my outfit. Like, was I allowed to maybe try sweatpants and a tee or something like that? And I wasn't allowed to. They said that if it's not spandex for safety in volleyball, they needed tight clothing because they felt like I couldn't move in a safe manner if my clothes weren't tight enough. And so I missed out completely on volleyball. And then that was actually the last sport I tried out for, because I just felt like it was such a pain to go through that process of one, explaining my faith, and two, the accommodations of my mom having to sit and sew me something or doing something like that. So all that's to say, the experiences do play a role in that. And I think for teachers, especially, how you respond is so crucial. So how you respond in those moments, you're not always going to get it right. And that's something you have to face. That's something you have to acknowledge, that as an educator, you're not going to get it right every time. The important thing is that when you don't get it right, we reflect, we understand, we acknowledge, and we don't do it again. And that's what's important. Whereas I've noticed a lot of times in education, sometimes as educators, we can get very defensive because we feel like our hearts are in the right place and we're doing the best we can. And how was I supposed to know? And what, and in those moments, it's understandable. The amount of pressure we put on educators is absolutely ridiculous. But in the same token, I think as educators, we have to step back and just take a moment of humility and go, I messed up. I totally messed up, and have that open heart to understand that. And I think that is the best way to be an educator, is understanding that, yes, there are a lot of pressures. Yes, it's unfair, a lot of the policies and things that are going your way, but that, with all due respect, has nothing to do with your ability to teach with love. And so that, I think, has to be the distinction of understanding our personal beef, quote unquote, with MMPS and the things that we feel, and understanding that that's not an excuse to then, when we do mess up, then our pressures and our concerns come out in that sense. So that's probably where I would go with that.
Yeah,
I think we all know that if students, if any human being, students in particular, since we're talking about them, if they don't feel safe and known, they will have a hard time being productive. That means it will affect attendance, it will affect engagement, it will affect their social emotional well-being. And it affects them even more so when it's a person in authority. Like Bethany, you mentioned that kids are being bullied and harassed by other adults in the building. We had an incident where right here in Nashville, Tennessee, a teacher took off the hijab of a student, videotaped, and put it on her private Snapchat video. And her excuse was, I was just mesmerized by her hair. Not only did she physically touched another minor, which was inappropriate, and it's another conversation, she removed an article of clothing off of a student, a minor, and then you videotape and you put it in a social media. So the amount of level like this particular teacher crossed, it was just unimaginable. How can you even think that would be okay? And so it does have an effect on students. Many of the Muslim students feel like they feel guarded when they enter the building. They're not really feeling like they're part of that school. So they struggle. And that's why sometimes they also have identity difficulties. They're like, okay, I'm gonna code switch. When I enter the school, I'm gonna present a different personality or a different piece of my identity. Right? That fluid identity. When I enter the building, I'm going to be a different person. And when I enter home, I'm different. And that has a huge impact on their social emotional being and then their productivity.
thank you. Oh yeah, Donna. Go ahead.
If I may, I was going to say something came to mind when Kusar was speaking. Hasina brought up the idea, I think, of or maybe it was Kusar, I'm not sure, of the idea of asking people where they're from. And as educators, I think when you do become an educator, a lot of times it's because you are a curious person. I think that's the idea, is that your curiosity drives you to want to encourage others to get curious, like Kusar was saying earlier. But I think there's a way to go about it. So I don't know, I kind of just want to explore that for a second. The idea of saying, like, where are you from? Or I had a teacher who, when you would tell them, Nashville, or for me personally, it's Pennsylvania, they would go, but where are you really from? And so there's this connotation of, like, that's all fine and dandy, but like, where are you really from, right? And that excludes a student immediately from the identity of being an American student and from just being a student in your classroom sometimes, because you're not asking anyone else. And so I find one of the, there's nothing wrong with wanting to know where someone is from, right? And so I think we need to make sure we understand that there is a difference between wanting to know where someone's from, which is beautiful. People are a lot of times proud of their heritage and where they come from. It's the way you ask. So I would lean more towards saying something in the effects of, what's your ethnic background? Instead of going, where are your parents from? Because even that, in a sense, even if they're not, you know, natural born citizens, a lot of our parents do believe themselves to be citizens of the US, right? Because that you can work your way to it. And so there are ways of going, what is your ethnic background? Or allowing a student some way, somehow to get it out without you asking. And that takes time. That takes time, and that takes a lot of thought, but it's worth it. The idea of, you know, sometimes in first weeks you do assignments where it's get to know yous and who are you and what do you love most, what are your favorite foods to eat, and sometimes they will come out with who they're from. So there might be the argument of like, well, that's all tiptoeing and that's, you know, that's so much work, but that's the idea of being an educator. You signed up to put the work in to know students. And so yes, it can be a hassle, but how far are you willing to go to really get to know your students in order for you to reach them even on an academic level?
I love that you said it may seem like tiptoeing, but everything you just described is trust building. And that's what the job of educators is. Do the students in front of me trust me enough to take care of them, both educationally and socially and emotionally? So yeah, thank you for naming that. I do want to talk more about these concepts of identities that we've been talking about. So the American Psychiatric Association has found that among Muslim adolescents, and especially girls, acculturative, that's a hard word to say, stress leads to more withdrawal, anxiety, and depression, regardless of being first or second generation, which you guys have just touched on a little bit. So in that regard, whose responsibility is it to make this space for children to talk about their various identities? And how do we as individuals, which we just kind of discussed a little bit, but then on a larger scale as institutions, offer that space? Kusar, I'll start with you.
Sure, that's a very, very powerful and loaded question. So I could take up all night, but I will not.
Perfect.
I think there's a lot that we can all do. And it's a responsibility, it's a collective responsibility, I should say. It is not just the responsibility of the student, the parent, or the family, or the Muslim community, or just the school alone. I think it's our collective. In order for us to have really impact, there has to be a collective effort to it. And I would say, for example, it begins with making sure that the student has what I call safe space, or a safe base. An individual, at least every student should have one person that they feel like they have an authentic relationship with, and that trust, genuine trust, is there. And I think it's the job of the school administrators and the teachers to actually make sure every single student has at least one person that they feel like could be their mentor or their safe space that they could go to. I think that's incredibly important, because our children are in schools for 8 hours a day. By the time they're home, they're eating dinner, they go to sleep. And then the same with the families, we need to do our part. I talk to my children all the time and say, who's in your trusted circle? Let's talk about it. Who in the family is in your trusted circle? Who is in your trusted circle in school, on the basketball team, in sports? So families need to have these conversations with their children and talk about what does it mean to have a trusted circle, and who do I go to? And particularly for females, right? There's this tendency of, in general, when females are facing sexual harassment or these, it's like, shh, don't say anything, it'll be worse. Right? We tend to tell the victim to keep it down, be quiet, or to just do something to cause this attention, which it's awful, right? What we need to do is tell the right person. Not everybody's the right person to know about it, but let's talk about who should hear it, and how you should share and be vulnerable without negatively impacting you. I think that's also really important. So on a people's level, I think the school should make sure there's an individual, right? Like, we need to talk about it. And then also on the community level, we need to start working collectively with our schools to provide the resources, right? Like, so we know our schools are underfunded. We know the schools don't have everything that they need to make sure that the school can actually thrive, or that every individual student can really thrive in that school. So that's where communities come in, right? This community partnership with outside organization, you know, thinking about who are the organizations that can provide services that the school cannot. What's the Oasis Center doing? What's Connexion Americas doing? What is AMAC doing, right? What is Faith and Culture Center doing? So the schools need to reach out for collective impact, and so do nonprofit community organizations. They need to do their part as well. We also have to question, what does it take, right? Should we put more social workers in the buildings, or do we put more police officers in the building? Which one would be more tangible, meaningful, proactive solution? And that needs to happen on the Metro Council level, on the state level. You see, so every single one of us have a role to play. What we need to do is question, who am I? What are the privileges that I have? What are the talents and resources that I have? And how can I use that privilege to impact the lives of others around me?
I don't even know how to follow that up. That was so beautiful, Kasar. Like that covered so many bases, and where each of us have our own touch points to get involved with this. So thank you so much. Does anyone have anything to add to that?
I think the one thing that I would add is like those spaces for reflection, not just for Muslim students, but for all of our students, is just often not there. Like, we are in academic spaces, we are in home spaces and religious spaces, but there's that space for kind of peer interaction, for people to be able to open up about questions, feeling like they are able to ask those questions that are difficult. There are so few spaces, and I would love to, you know, think about how to cultivate those spaces, right? It's because often we think about home spaces, and there's an expectation that you will have a certain level of religiosity in religious spaces or act a certain way. How can we provide a space for youth to really share what they're thinking and what they're feeling in a way that they can feel confident about developing those skills and having those conversations in the future? I think that is so difficult because we just don't have those spaces of reflection and those spaces for those conversations. I would love it to be, I agree with Kasara 100%, a combination. It needs to be a combination of different stakeholders in our youth lives. But yeah, just what does it mean to have that space?
But it also requires us to prioritize those spaces too, right? Like, oh, I'm in a panel. I'm so sorry. Excuse me. Sorry. I think what you're pointing to, and I think this is really a disservice that we are doing to our youth, is there's such a pressure now for them to be, perfect, right? Like, they have to be on the basketball team, and they have to make straight A's, and they need to be on leadership, and they need to do debate. And like, Kasar, what you're talking about, and what all of us are talking about, is not only creating those spaces and being involved, but really prioritizing that to say, like, this is just as important, if not more, than like making the basketball team. Like, creating that area is, I think, and creating that space and that opportunity to be vulnerable is like, needs to be a priority. It shouldn't be something that we just assume will happen organically, because we know it just doesn't. I have it from my experience, it just doesn't.
Yeah, there's a couple of other things I would love to like just highlight, just because I also just read the comments. You're right, Julie. Like, for example, I was brought up when I came to United States. In my elementary year, I grew up in a refugee camp. So I didn't have any formal education, though I believe my learning never stopped. I was learning and growing, but I didn't have formal education. So when I came to United States, I was in middle school. And I remember my mother saying this to me: One, because we're Muslim, and in particularly Oklahoma City bombing took place. And then we were refugees. So when she would send me to school, she was like, you be extra good. Do you hear me? No matter how hard people try to provoke you, you make sure you just raise your head up and you continue and you work extra hard. You have to prove to them that you are good and that people can feel safe around you, right? So there was this pressure of that. And then secondly, because my parents never had a formal education themselves due to wars and poverty, and they came here to the United States, they actually did not understand the American education system in order to advocate and fight for me, right? And so there was also so much trust in authority figures, right? Of like, if the principal said this, we just listen and go. Or that there was so much trust in teachers saying, okay, they are the ones who have the degree and have alphabets next to their name, so they must know what's the best way to educate my child, right? So there was a bit too much of a trust with like my parents raising me, of just like sending me to school and saying they know what's best, you know, just suck it up, listen and be as, again, extra good. You hear me? Like, to be extra good is very important. So there is that pressure.
We do need to open it up for Q&A, but Julie, I know one thing that you really wanted to touch on were how to address these assimilation strategies that we do put on students. And Kausar, you saying that about your mom telling you that with the best of intentions, but how is that then translated in the school for a child? What does good look like? Is it assimilating to the majority culture or the American culture, or trying to cross cultures and look different from who we are? So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A if that's okay. Julie, sorry. That's all you.
Sorry. So like how do we address assimilation strategies? Is that your question? I mean, I think it comes with really recognizing first and foremost our own biases, like really, like as individuals, as I mean, if we're speaking about education, as individuals, as what we do in our classrooms, how we treat others, how administration treats students and faculty, those tend to differ. I mean, it is so, the funnel is so big, but I believe that being honest and open with ourselves is really the first place where we start. And that is the only, I think that until that mirror is held up and we can really start to think about that, I don't, you know, I think assimilation, I have really mixed feelings about assimilation. I mean, as a Reformed Jew, I am very much assimilated in what I do and how we observe and how we live our life. And I also know that there's a part of me that doesn't feel like I need to assimilate, and that part of my identity is something that I don't really feel like I need to compromise on. But I just think that there's a level of honesty and reflection that we need to have to be able to change those policies that Kausar was talking about, that Bana had addressed about, you know, teachers start with a good heart and they come in, but we don't always get it right. And that requires learning on our ends as educators, you know, and we all, hopefully all strive to be lifelong learners. But I would love to hear my panelists' thoughts.
If I could add to Kausar's idea, the whole thing she said about, you know, how her mom said, it rang such familiarity for me. I'm a student now, but especially when I was in high school and college, it's a bit more lenient, but especially in high school, I think it's something interesting to think about that a lot of Muslim immigrant parents, a lot of immigrant parents in general, but especially Muslim immigrant parents who bring their kids, and their kids are first generation students, a lot of times first generation Americans, there is this sense of all we're allowed to really have is gratitude. We should be extremely grateful for the opportunity to be here, which we are. We should be extremely grateful for what this country did for us in saving a lot of us in many ways from war and war zone. The problem is a lot of these parents will also come with this idea that we need to make as little noise and cause as little attention to ourselves as we can in order for us to harbor the success that this country can give us. And in that mentality, what you have is parents who are telling their kids, me especially, of, can you please just not say anything today? Can you just go to class and just be good and just listen? Like, do you have to feel a need to always, ask, do you know what I mean? Curiosity I'm going to speak on my personal experience. For my parents was very much, it's okay in bounds. So you can be curious about geography, you can be curious about math, you can be curious about, English arts or anything like that. But the moment you start to get curious about, well, why does that Muslim student get to do this? Or why does this, then you're crossing a line. In my family, that's how it was. And so to Kasar's point, a lot of our parents come from countries where authority is a very big deal. Like, being a principal, being a teacher, being a police officer, being any of those things is a very big deal. And what happens with authority, you're automatically guaranteed trust. So in that sense, this idea where, in American schooling, it's if you have a problem, you complain, you go to someone, you tell the principal, you go to a counselor, right? Or there's so many things in place for parents that are aware in this country to go and give their concerns. But a lot of immigrant parents, they don't know that. They don't understand that. And even when they're told about these things, a lot of times what happens is the fear of feeling like I'm already taking up space, which is somehow a sin. So I'm just going to sit this one out. Suck it up. We're going to deal with it. You're going to be fine. You're not bleeding. You're okay. Right. And so I think that for some of us immigrants, that has been the experience of curiosity is limited because authority rules all.
Thank you. Cecina, did you want to say something about that?
I think in addition to that narrative, there is also a huge narrative about patience, and that patience will be rewarded, and that if you are going through something and you are patient with it, then you will get rewarded for that. And that has kept a lot of people from speaking out about discrimination, about bullying, about harassment, because that real religious belief that you will be rewarded for having patience. But it's also a part of Islam to speak out against oppression, to speak out against things that are being done that is wrong. And that is not emphasized, but is equally a part of our faith. And so I think just how we as a community approach these different narratives, because both are and a part of our faith, very definitely dealing with things with patience is an Islamic value and belief. How do we balance that with also the belief that we should fight out against oppression, that we should speak out, that we should try to correct the things that are wrong in society and have our part in that process. So I think these are also important things that are part of our faith that we need to help both our community and our youth think about. I do think it's changing. I mean, you will see a lot of young Muslim leaders out there who are very vocal about oppression that is happening, social injustices in our community that are very passionate about that. At the same time, there are a lot of people who won't speak out because of their belief that we should deal with things with patience. So, yeah.
So I don't want to talk too much about assimilation. I have issues with that because I believe assimilation is a tactic of white dominant supremacy in this country. However, what I want to talk about is some solutions to maybe get rid of these gaps or disparities. And so an example of that or a suggestion that I have is if you're an educator, whether you're an administrator or a teacher, think about what are existing programs or initiatives that are reaching out to the Muslim students. How are we educating and informing the parents so they could know about the education system and they know their rights and their responsibilities? Are they being informed and are they being connected? Are we really talking about parent involvement or family engagement? And I use those two words because family is huge in the Muslim community. There's more than one person who influences you. It could be your uncle, your auntie, or whatever, your grandma. They're all in your circle, right? So that family needs to be part of it, right? And engagement has to be a two-way street. It should never be involvement where the school just needs to shove down some piece of information or wants a signature from a parent and it's gone. It should be engagement, a two-way street. Asking the parents and the students, what would be meaningful to you? What type of classrooms would you like? Start questioning the curriculum. I want every teacher to pay attention. How many books are written by Muslim authors? What type of stories are told? What kind of history is told? Are we teaching from a very singular narrative? Even about American history, we know for a fact at the time of Christopher Columbus, he had Muslims with him, right? There were people even predate slavery. So whose story is being told, right? Like there are significant American Muslim story and culture that purposefully is being singled out and not included. And so going back to representation matters. And so if students, if they don't see themselves reflected in the curriculum, in the history, in the science and social studies that you're teaching, how are they going to really meaningfully engage and impact it? For our teachers, you know, there's great questions about how do I even connect and engage, right? I would say be curious, go back to that curiosity that you're born with and authentically be willing to create those relationships and see the person on an individual level. Students differ, right? So we're talking about some who may, and when it comes to spirituality in Islam, it's a very personal journey, right? So you can't just look at someone and say, oh, you're not wearing a hijab, you're not Muslim, right? No, to be a Muslim doesn't require, like, it's not one of the 5 pillars of Islam. I don't have to publicly tell everybody that I'm a Muslim, right? There are some who choose to cover. So that spiritual journey, they're all over the place. And there are some who are like cultural Muslims. They're just Muslim, they have a Muslim name, but if you look at them, they're practicing quite differently. So being authentically wanting to build a relationship with your student is incredibly important. And that takes time. And it takes some genuine thought of like, why do I want to build this relationship? And what type of impact do I want to create? Listen to them, hear from them directly, right? I think I always push even myself to talk about that there's a reason for why God created people with free will. We are born with a free will and no one has the right to take away that free will from you. How you choose to practice, what you choose to choose in your life, that is your God-given right, and no one has the right to take that away.
Thank you, Kassar. Okay, we're going to open it up for Q&A now. If you want to go ahead and turn on your cameras, this is a time that we would love for you to interact with our panelists. And obviously, they have so much knowledge and wisdom to share with us. So I look forward to hearing what questions you all have after listening to this. No cameras on. Okay, so what I'm going to do is start with questions in the chat. And then if you guys think of anything, turn on your camera, ask the question. It's totally okay. So I'm going to start with Miriam Fricko. She teaches online and she's asking, she can't see her students, so she doesn't know their identity. So asking about how can she understand to learn more about her blind spots as a teacher. And I think especially right now, in this age of Zoom, here we are, more and more educators are facing that same issue. So what would you suggest? Any of you panelists, hello?
I really feel awful taking up airspace, but if no one's going, I'm going.
That's why you're here, Kassar. It's totally okay.
And I really want to appreciate, I'm sorry, who, Mary Ann said that? I really want to appreciate you, Mary. It shows the courage that you have and the willingness to address. We all have imperfections and we all lack certain piece of information. And so what I would say is actually first start with yourself, and just do an analysis of like, who am I and what do I know about my Muslim population and what are the topics that I'm curious about, and then go to Google Scholar. The other Google is a little scary, but go to Google Scholar and then search for which Muslim is willing to talk about the topic that I'm really curious about, because I think it's very important not to burden a Muslim to be an expert in a topic that they don't feel like talking about or want to talk about. So first do some research, right, around that. It could be something around, I just want to know why some Muslim women cover and put on a hijab. There are many people who are willing to share that story. They have written, they've sang, they've written poems. And so do some research around that first. What can I find in the library? Read multiple things. Don't stick to one perspective. Like we were talking about, there's a diversity of perspectives in Islam and diversity of like the way faith is addressed in Islam. So read a couple different perspectives and then reach out to some of the students, and have a conversation or invite them to have a conversation if they're willing to have the conversation.
We'll also add that almost every mosque in Nashville has open houses all the time, and would really invite everyone to go and to participate and to ask questions there as well, if there are specific questions that you want to know about, because those are what those forums are for. As Kassar said, not everybody will want to answer every question, but those spaces are meant to have those discussions. And I think the Muslim community really wants to build understanding with our neighbors and share our faith and to share our stories. And so I think there are several, and FCC does a wonderful job of putting on events to help deepen understanding as well. So I think there are several opportunities in and around Nashville to also have conversations.
Yeah, and I think as, honestly, as an educator, like, kudos to you for even thinking about it, because I do think some educators, you can honestly fly by without getting to know your students. It's not difficult. You can still be somewhat arguably academically successful with your students without getting to know who they are. But like I said, I swear by getting to know you activities. I think that's a really big deal. I think there are not a waste of time, but they feel like throughout the semester they will just get to know their students. I think that's one of the biggest mistakes you can make. It's never too late to do a get to know you activity. It allows you to get to know them, but it also encourages your students to self-explore. There are many times where your students don't even know all the answers of like, what are the 5 things you like to do? Or what are the, who do you like to listen to and why, and things like that. Sometimes they don't even have the answers ready. And so you're encouraging them to self-explore while also getting the benefit as an educator to get to know your students on a level that's has nothing to do with academics.
So I actually heard the question a little differently, and I heard the question as asking what are ways that we can recognize our own blind spots as educators. I think that what a blind spot is exactly that. It's this thing that we don't see about ourselves. And a lot of times we don't know that it's there until it all of a sudden is there. And that is a really uncomfortable moment for us. There are lots of places that you can turn to for diversity training, inclusion training that can help us become more aware of our blind spots. The chat is like totally blowing up right now, I think, with different places that you can turn to learn about diversity. Kassar, I mean, she is the dean of diversity and inclusion at KIPP. I mean, there are places, there's lots of resources just on this panel alone to help us really recognize our own blind spots, but I think that's what they are. We don't know they're there until we know they're there. And that is the hard part about them. just a funny story of one time when I was working on my PhD at Florida State. My professor actually wanted to read every single student's paper blind. And so he made everybody come up with aliases to their papers, and he wouldn't let any of us, he would just read the paper based on the alias of whoever the name was. And so even something, what I thought was so interesting about that is even something as small as a name, we have preconceived notions about who John Smith is online, or we might have preconceived notions about who Julie Fortune is online. Like there's so much in just a name that we have assumptions about. So I really think that like actively engaging in ways to learn about your blind spots through diversity training is a really proactive and uncomfortable way to go. But I also think that it can really help all of us move forward.
I'd just like to add one more thing. I feel like we are in a time and space where we all need to reflect on what it means to be Muslim and support the Black Lives Matter movement, to be Muslim and think about these things. And we don't often have that in our courses, but it affects how we interact with people. It affects how we're reading material, and just the space within a classroom to think about how what's happening in our nation is affecting us as students and as people, I think would be so valuable, right? And I think it would not just benefit Muslim students, but all students, because we don't have that time to talk about that in a meaningful way. Because all that is happening right now is really affecting all of us daily, and we're not talking about it. Thinking about how I personally have internalized racism, have, navigated my power and privilege, and am I using it effectively, are like, who do I talk to about that? Where do I talk about that? So the extent to which reflections aren't just like who I am, but also how I'm dealing with, thinking about the current moment and integrating what I'm learning and trying to do all of those things, I think is also really powerful and important. So the extent to which we can bring those pieces to our students as well and have them have a space to think about that. And I think it is we do have to think about developmentally appropriate ways of doing that. But I think that that's really important to think about as well.
Thank you. Nahed, you have your hand raised. Did you have a question?
Yes, I had a question. I'm not going to go on camera though.
It's okay.
As I'm listening, I'm thinking, and Julie, I'd be curious about your students' experience here in just a second, but it seems to me that we're talking about symptoms, whereas the underlying problem is that, especially for Muslim kids, is that the people who are supposed to be their teachers, their educators, people who are supposed to be safe and supporting them are themselves living with Islamophobia. And the religion is there's so much ignorance about Islam in this country, and especially in this part of the world. And we live in a place in which it has become like almost okay, if not sliding into the mainstream, to hold Islamophobic sentiments and ideas. And this question about how do we get institutions to focus on the right things? Well, institutions are not organisms in and of themselves. They're made up by people. So it requires people, leadership, who is willing to take on this problem and lead towards a solution. And when your teacher, when your coach is saying you need to take off your headgear or you can't play, that demonstrates such lack of sensitivity, such lack of understanding. I mean, it's mind-boggling. So the solution, I mean, I think these things just simply don't go away without without a concerted effort to ensure that Muslims are not seen as foreign, and that Muslims are not seen as exotic, and that Muslims are not seen as other, that they're seen as members of our community just like anybody else. Julie, I'm curious, like what, teaching at a school where I'm assuming like the vast majority of your families are Jewish, as are the teachers, right? So they're in a place where their faith is known, they're understood, their holidays are celebrated. Once they leave Akiva and they go on to schools in which they are the minority, what's that experience like for them?
Julie, you're muted.
Sorry, technical issues. You would think that by like 2020, by now I would have figured out how to unmute myself, but clearly not. So for those who don't know, Akiva is the only Jewish day school in Middle Tennessee. The closest ones are in Memphis and in Knoxville. You are required to have at least one Jewish parent in order to be able to attend Akiva. The idea behind that is that children need to be able to have a safe space where they can develop a sense of self and who they are and who their tradition and what their tradition is and how they choose to observe their faith within that tradition. Because like we were saying earlier, whether we're talking about Islam or Judaism or Christianity, like it's not like there's not like a group of Jews and that's it. There's lots of different ways to practice and observe. What we have found with our students is that they develop a deep sense of self and that they don't feel this pressure of assimilation the same way I think other students might feel in other schools. There is a level of appreciation for their uniqueness in this way. There is a level of there's a sense of self of why they believe what they believe and how they choose to stand up for others who are different than them. The bottom line is that most teenage boys don't wear kippot, or yarmulkes as we call, they don't wear those. And so it doesn't, people can walk by them and say really hateful things and not even know that they are saying hateful things to them. But we have found is that, when they move forward, having developed that sense of self and we were talking about creating a safe space where children can find that one adult that they can really talk to and connect to and ask those questions in their safe circle. And they have been afforded that opportunity. Our students have been afforded that opportunity at a young age. And so they know they feel empowered to be able to do that in the future. But not all students have that, that's just the bottom line. And so I think that shouldn't be a privilege. That should be a right for everybody to be able to have advocates for them. That should be a right for people to be able to explore and be curious about who they are and who others are. But it's not. And I just feel like that is like such a failure on all of us, from all of us, for our children and our future to not consciously and proactively create spaces where we can make that happen for our kids. I don't know if that answered your question, Nahed. I can't see you, so like it's hard for me to see if you're nodding or
I'm
like
nodding.
Okay, let's just see your beautiful photo. But our students do well, but that comes with 7 years of intentional instruction on developing a sense of self, on having an SEL, or social emotional learning curriculum, where we really strategically like work with students with this. So it's not something that just happens. It's something that we work really, really hard on.
Thanks, Julie.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think my
Right.
good friend Mary Pat had a question.
Yes, thank you very much. And hey, Daoud, I didn't see you before, so I could say hi. I actually have a couple of comments now. I want to react just quickly to the discussion we just had, that to your comments, Julie. I went to Catholic school from kindergarten through 12th grade. And so I have a good sense of what it means to go to a religious school. And there were certainly some very good things about it, but I also think that that they can foster a kind of exclusion. I mean, I was only among Catholics, and of course went to church with Catholics. My whole community was one community, and I had virtually no meaningful interaction with anybody who was not Catholic and white, by the way, as I grew up in Nashville, back in the day of segregation. So I think it's a mixed bag, frankly. Yes, you get a strong sense of self, but you may get such a strong sense of one part of yourself that you perhaps lose other parts. But the original comment I wanted to make, I found the discussion about assimilation interesting. Kasar, you talked a lot about that. Oh my goodness, excuse me. I'm very sorry, I just got a phone call and it knocked me out. I'm gonna just turn off my phone. I think it's a hard one. I think there are some aspects of citizens in any country where some assimilation is required. And let me just move away for a minute from a national context. Those of you who know me know that I spent my career in the United Nations. In the Secretariat, I didn't represent a government, I represented the Secretary General. We were from all over the world. We kept intact, certainly our religion, our national cultures, our genders, of course, but we did have a supra identity that was assimilated. There were certain ideals to which we all ascribed and lived by, and certain ways of behaving that were understood to be accepted and the norm and the proper way to behave. So, I mean, my point is, I think some level of assimilation, but I'm happy to have a discussion about this because I'm not so sure about what I think. Some level of assimilation is necessary. Some agreement about the principles that govern us, while we maintain our individual selves, our religions, our personalities, all the things that may make us who we are. But we can't just say we don't assimilate. So I'm interested in the conversation about that.
I'll weigh in if there's time. I think there's a big difference, Mary, between assimilation and integration. An example of that, when I came to the United States, I absolutely wanted to learn the English so I can connect with my people, my neighbors, my friends, and just be able to communicate. But I didn't want to ignore and forget my Kurdish language. So having a law or an ordinance or a policy that says absolutely no Kurdish allowed, no. Like that, I feel like you're trying to tell me that just because I'm now living in America, that all of a sudden I have to be dipped into the water, go as a Kurd, come back as an American, and like wash everything else about my identity away. That's not healthy either. like, I think integration, you're right. Like, I believe, for example, we need a common language, but I also think it's a beautiful thing. I wish I had a magic wand. I could tap myself and speak every language on earth. There's nothing wrong about knowing another language or keeping a language, right? And so even when you're talking about cultures and policies, right, what makes America beautiful is that you have a set of rules in the Constitution, right? Policies in the Constitutions, law in the Constitution, that makes, I were to question what makes an American American, it's oftentimes the democratic values that we hold, not the way you look, you sound, or the way you talk and walk, right? Like, we believe in individual freedoms, we believe in democracy, we believe in the empowerment of individuals. And so those sets of freedoms, even though those freedoms, when they were written for only white men, for example, right? However, this is what it means. And so I do believe in that, like, we start to accept those beliefs, right? And I think it's a beautiful thing, but not in terms of assimilation where you forget everything about who you are and you must adapt to the, norms of the majority, which really all the assimilation culture has actually been written by white people to really whitewash everyone else here. That's including Native Americans, African Americans, and even the other immigrants who come here, right? There's like this snatch of let's make them to be white and have a culture of white. Now, I personally, someone who's like raised into two different cultures, my personal belief and perspective is this, and I raise my kids this way. I say, analyze both your Kurdish culture and your American culture. Take what is best from both culture and ignore what is not good, what is unhealthy part of these cultures. Let it go, right? An example of that, in the Kurdish culture, if you're a foreigner, there's utmost respect given to you. You go to Kurdistan and you visit there, people will respect you so much. The hospitality that they give you and the respect, I said, keep that. Here in America, if you're a foreigner, you're degraded and inhumanly treated, right? And so there are things that I feel like are beautiful about, quote unquote, the American culture that I feel should be adapted. And there are things that we need to say, hey, like I will not be a devout American if I don't call out the part of our culture that are toxic and unhealthy for us as a nation and as a world leader. Other people are looking up to us or looking at us how we solve these societal imperfections that we face today.
If I may, I don't think we disagree, Kassar. Perhaps I didn't express myself so eloquently as you. I think we agree that there is a certain assimilation of beliefs in, as you said, the Constitution, in a certain rule of law, in certain values, which doesn't mean that that then requires that everything else has to be assimilated. I think you know very well, I don't think we should all walk around and look and talk and think like white men or white anybody, or, you know, I love diversity. Frankly, one of the things I really dislike about Portland is that it is so white. I feel like I'm a Stepford wife here, but that's another issue.
I know you miss the Kurdish kebabs, Mary Pat.
You bet. You bet. So I don't think we really disagree. I just wanted to make a point that I think, I mean, still to be an American has a certain should have a certain common meaning to which we all subscribe. That's all.
I would just kind of throw out there, and I know Mallory, we've gone way over, but I would just say, I think that
I'm sorry.
The big thing for me is choice, right? Like the extent to which we are formally or informally punished for acting a certain way, speaking a certain way, dressing a certain way. I think there are, for different groups of people, an easier time making the choice to authentically integrate different parts of language, culture, and be all of that. Kasar mentioned code switching. For a lot of people, they actually feel like they will be punished if they don't dress a certain way, act a certain way, speak a certain way, and therefore their choice has been limited because of the repercussions of their actions, which I think is what assimilation points to. That doesn't mean we can't authentically hold different aspects of our identity that may be more maybe more reflective of the mainstream culture, maybe more reflective of our individual ethnic cultures. But that idea of assimilation limiting choice, I think, is really important to point out and to recognize that not everybody has the same choices, and that they do have to code switch or dress a certain way or act a certain way in order to get the privileges that are afforded to other people, like just by virtue of who they are. So I think that that's like a lot of the discussion on assimilation that people want to push back on.
Thanks, Hasina. Well, friends, obviously this is such an incredible and an important conversation, and I hate to close it, but to honor the time that each of you already has given and that you've agreed to, I do need to close out our time tonight. So firstly, let me just say a sincere thank you to each of our panelists for offering of your time, insight, energy, and passions. It's been a gift, and one that we do not take for granted or take lightly. So thank you sincerely for what you've offered here, for all the ways that you're offering and serving our students in Nashville and beyond. Thank you. To those of you who have joined us for this conversation, I want to end with one final note. As we've talked about all of these different ways that we're seeking to be in service to students, addressing not just their sort of formal educational, like cognitive experience, but their social, emotional, and mental health and all these things, and particularly the idea of curiosity and wanting to really engender that within our students. I'm going to invite each of us to return to that as we reflect on this conversation. Become curious about the points at which you found great connection, the points at which you found great resonance, the points at which you found great resistance, the points that were frustrating or difficult, the points that brought great relief and joy and insight. Have curiosity around those things and let those be the points that you continue to pursue, hopefully in greater conversation with even some of the folks here that we've gotten to hear tonight, and certainly with our larger FCC community. In the email that I'm going to send following this with the recording, I'm also going to invite each of you, we're scheduling out some our seat at the table events for the fall. And to me, that is an excellent place to continue and initiate some of these types of conversations across divides. And so I hope that you'll take advantage of that. We look forward to seeing you there. Thanks again on behalf of FCC to each of you, for the panelists, for your time, for the rest of you for joining us. Best to you, and we'll see you back in a few weeks for our 4th table talk. Good night.
Night.
Bye.
Thank you.